Hi everyone, Joe Yudin, owner of Touring Israel here. Today I have for you Lt Col Sarit Zehavi. She's the CEO and founder of Alma, a nonprofit and independent research and education center specializing in Israel security challenges on the northern border. Hello Sarit, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Great, it's good to see you. Several years ago I heard about you. And I know you were a lieutenant colonel in, I believe it was the intelligence unit of the IDF, correct?
Yes.
And I think it was Wendy Perrin, who was a former Condé Nast Traveler digital editor and has gone off on her own and started her own travel magazine, up on a tour with you of the border with Lebanon and Syria, and it just blew me away. And ever since then, and not just you have so many amazing officers and former officers from the IDF working with you who give these incredible debriefings about what's going on in the Middle East. And it's just incredible. And it opened my eyes. And, you know, I'm just a lowly sergeant major in the paratroopers. You guys know much more about what's going on than I do. And I said, you know, for an hour, 2-hour tour, it's much better if you guys do it than me. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Alma, how you got into Alma, and what you do, and about the tours?
Well, when I was in the Army, I was an intelligence officer in the Northern Command, and I briefed a lot of delegations that wanted an intelligence briefing at the Lebanese border mainly. And when I was discharged from the Army due to Crohn's disease, not Corona, Crohn's disease, it's different. I knew that this is what I want to do. I want to speak to people. I want to explain what is happening here. I live up north in the Galilee, about 7 miles from the Israeli-Lebanese border. And I want to engage and explain people the reality as I experience it. In a gradual process, I have established Alma. Alma is my little girl, by the way. She was born when I left the Army, and I named the small business after her. But afterwards, it's not a small business anymore. Today, it's a non-profit organization. You can see how it looks like. It's a small part of it. And actually, it's a research and education center, because we understand that in order to speak and explain what's going on, we must follow every day, by the way, from sources from Arabic, social media and media, to know what is happening on the northern border. So we have a research department, and we publish all the time, and we find photos and videos and articles that we write. And of course, these days, we're doing a lot of webinars. But we also meeting when it's okay, before the Corona crisis. Of course, we meet many groups along the northern borders of Israel, and we take them to places that they usually don't get. This is Avram, by the way. He lives next to this fence. This is next to his home. He raised 8 children there. Unbelievable. Wow. In the Golan, this is next to this is the Syrian border. You wouldn't find a fence like that in the Lebanese border. So he lives next in the Golan Heights, next to the Syrian border. And he's also responsible for the digital department in Alma. So all of us working in Alma, by the way, from different backgrounds, we can speak about what's going on, but we are also having a position in Alma. Ilan is another speaker. You see him here. He's a brigadier general. I'm very proud that he joined our staff. He served many years in Lebanon when IDF was still in Lebanon.
In the infantry, correct?
I'm sorry?
In the infantry, right?
The infantry, the Golani Brigade, that all of us are really proud of. Ilan was my commander with the reserves. When I was in the reserves, this is how I met him. He was the chief of staff of the Northern Command between 2013 to 2015, meaning that he made a lot of decisions of the Israeli strategy on the Syrian-Israeli border. Behind him, by the way, he's standing there on the Lebanese border, and behind him, up on the hill, it's a Lebanese army position that used to be an Israeli position when we were inside Lebanon.
So today there's a lot of going on in southern Lebanon right now. You say that's a Lebanese army position. So does that mean it's the actual regular army of Lebanon, or are there other terrorist groups who are together with the Lebanese army in that position overlooking Israel?
It means that it's the Lebanese army position that many times is being used by Hezbollah, which is almost the only terrorist group down there, but the term terrorist group is misleading because actually Hezbollah today, it's another army. Lebanon is one country, one government, two armies. The one is the Lebanese army and the other one is Hezbollah, which is much stronger and much more dangerous than the Lebanese army. And yes, Hezbollah is using Lebanese army vehicles, uniforms, watching towers for their own needs in South Lebanon.
And so who's in charge? Is it Hezbollah, or is it the Lebanese army? Is it the government, or is it the Narsala, the mullah in charge of Hezbollah? Who's in charge there? Is anyone in charge there?
It's the Middle East, so everybody is in charge and nobody is in charge. Okay. It means that it depends on what aspect you mean and what area. South Lebanon, no doubt, Hezbollah is in charge. It's in the hands of Hezbollah. You now see a map of Syria, which is another great example for the question, who is in charge? Full of colors, full of areas of influence. Light blue, for example, is the area that is under the influence of the Americans. Orange is the area that is under the influence of Kurds or under the control of the Kurds. The blue inside the orange is an area under the control of the Turks. The green is an area under control of, used to be rebels, but actually today it's the branch of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And the big pink area is the area under control of Syrian government and its allies. And what is more important is the allies, which is actually Iranian proxies there, and a little bit of Russian presence in the terrain.
And so where are the Iranians in that picture?
Okay, so here you can understand where the Iranians. First, the Iranians in Syria, a presence in Syria in very small forces. Now, I want to explain what I've just said. The Iranians are controlling Syria by proxies, by militias that are not Persian speakers, such as Pakistani, Afghani, Iraqi, and Syrians themselves that are subordinate to Iranian commanders. Everybody heard about Soleimani that was assassinated by the Americans in Iraq 6 months ago. He was the commander of these militias, and that's how the Iranians are actually getting control in Syria. What you see in this map is what everybody called the ground corridor. The roads that are actually enabling Iran to transfer from Tehran, which is on the right upper side of the map, all the way to Damascus inside Syria and the pink areas in Syria, to transfer ammunition, soldiers, merchandise, and that way to establish its control inside Syria. So
just yesterday, the Russians with the UN are trying to open up arms deals, which is just the ban on selling military equipment to Iran has just expired, and the Americans are trying to re-implement it, and the Russians are and the Chinese are like, no way, we'll veto any new sanctions on Iran on the military ban. How is that going to affect the situation?
If actually this will happen, and it seems like it is going to happen, it means that the Iranians will be able to transfer much more arms into Syria. And the big question is what kind of arms into Syria, whether they're going to get from the Russians more anti-aircraft sophisticated systems, which until today the Russians supplied in a very limited way and very limited amount. And whether these are going to end up in the hands of Hezbollah, which is also presence greatly in Syria, including next to the Israeli-Syrian border. We just had a webinar about that last week. So yes, the sanctions against Iran and the ban to sell arms to Iran was really important, and I hope that it will not change.
Well, that doesn't look like it's going to happen. And also, so the Russians are in Latakia, right? They have a base on the port there, and we really can't fly our planes over any Russian areas. The Russians have put S-300 anti-aircraft missile batteries all over, but they haven't used them. And also Israel is being very careful to launch their attacks on these Iranian movement of arms into Syria and Lebanon, but to destroy these convoys and underground bases, but not by flying over Syria. Now that's what we read in the news. What's really going on?
Well, Joe, you didn't expect me to answer all of your questions today, right?
Right.
All I can say that in the past few years, Israel attacked hundreds of times in Syria. These Iranian and Hezbollah military assets. In most cases, Israel never said we did it, but in general, our leadership admitted that we are doing it. And this is extremely important because this is the only way we've got to prevent accurate missiles. This is one thing that is being attacked. Chemical capabilities, let's put it this way, and anti-aircraft sophisticated systems to prevent this from getting to the hands of hostile militias, Iranian militias, or hostile Hezbollah. If it will get to Lebanon, which is this is what Hezbollah is desiring, it would mean that we will not be able to attack them anymore, because in Lebanon they are hidden inside the villages, inside the civilian infrastructure, whether it's in Beirut or in South Lebanon. And that's why you've seen hundreds of attacks in Syria, while in Syria they're hidden inside the Syrian army bases or just in military bases, not within the population, which is not Shiite. And that's why it's not supporting this effort of the Iranians.
Right. And there was a deal with the Russians about a year ago that between Bibi Netanyahu and his government, our government, and the Russians, that the Russians would keep the Iranian and their proxies. First, we wanted 150 kilometers away from our border, and then I think they agreed on 80 kilometers from the border. But you're telling me now Hezbollah is right on our border in the Golan Heights in Syria. So does that go against this agreement?
Well, nobody saw the agreement. Okay. Right. So by the Russian version, it seems like they are saying we are not violating the agreement. The Iranians are not there, which is correct. The Iranians are not there, but Hezbollah is there, and Hezbollah is subordinate to the Iranians. And Hezbollah is there with two units. One is composed of Lebanese commanders, Lebanese Hezbollah commanders that are actually training the Syrian army and are preparing the infrastructure to times of war. And in another unit, which is composed of mainly Syrian locals that are subordinate to this Lebanese Hezbollah, which is subordinate to these Iranians, okay? And the other unit, which is called the Golan File or the Golan Portfolio, is capable of carrying out, and that's its mission, to carry out terrorist attacks against Israel from the border, from the Israeli-Syrian border, which you can see in the map.
I mean, this is a real mess. Of course, it all started with the Syrian civil war and with Al Qaeda taking over large swaths, and basically Hezbollah was one of the main forces, the Shiite terrorist army within another army, another country, organization. They're pretty battle hardened now. They're probably the best force other than Israel in the region. I mean, what can we expect to happen when Iranians start moving more better equipment into southern Syria, into Lebanon? And we have to assume that Israel didn't catch every single convoy going into Lebanon, that some of this equipment did get through. What's going to happen in the next 5 years?
Nobody knows whether the next war would be tomorrow, next week, or in 5 years. I'm taking a deep breath because when I'm saying this sentence, I always calculate the date that my son should go to the army. But what I mean is that I think that it doesn't only depend on the capabilities of the other side, of Hezbollah or of Iran, but also on the intentions. And when we speak about intentions, we speak about Israel deterrent. And now you can see a photo of the fence of the border, and I want to say one word about deterrent. A month ago, Hezbollah cut 3 holes in this fence in an area which is very close to where I took this photo. I was standing on the Israeli side of the road and just looking to the Lebanese side and took the photo. And in 3 holes in 3 different places that are in a distance of about 30 miles from each other, and put a package on the Israeli side, like created a hole, put the package inside the Israeli side and disappeared. And when IDF had to what we call neutralize, meaning to bomb the package to make sure it's not explosive, it took the IDF a few hours to deal with this incident. Why is this matter? Because on the one hand, it brings the message that Hezbollah is not afraid getting to the fence, creating holes in the fence, but on the other hand, it is afraid to cross the fence, enter into Israel and kill people, which is part of its contingency plans. So when you're asking what would happen, I can describe what would happen in the next war, but I actually don't know when this next war will happen. And I know that in the next war, we will deal with penetration of thousands of Hezbollah combatants that are well experienced from the war in Syria through this fence that you can see in the photo. And on top of that, we will experience tons of artillery. Evaluations are about 100,000 different kinds of artilleries to different ranges in Israel, including Tel Aviv and even southern to Tel Aviv. And this is something that we can survive, but the price will be a price that I, as a mother, I'm not willing to pay. And that's why the main mission of the IDF is not only to prepare to war, but also to postpone it as much as possible and create effective deterrent.
Right. So in 2006, Hezbollah did the same thing. They cut some holes in the fence. They snuck inside of Israel. They ambushed a IDF patrol and killing, I believe, 2 soldiers, and took their bodies away and ran back into Lebanon. We didn't know if they were dead or alive. We shelled their positions. We chased after them. They started shooting rockets into the civilian areas. 17,000 rockets, I think, were fired, maybe more. And the next thing I know, I'm in green in Lebanon, fighting for the next 5 weeks, Hezbollah. And it was later found out that Hezbollah had made a miscalculation, that they didn't think that what they were doing was going to start a war. And because of that miscalculation, it's been relatively quiet. Well, for that reason, for that on the one hand, and on the other hand, they've been busy in Syria. So it seems to me that they, if they do invade Galilee and they do launch artillery, which is much harder to shoot out of the sky with Iron Dome than missiles, they start shooting artillery into Israel at civilian areas, our response will be 100-fold. I mean, we will have, even though they shoot their artillery from roofs of houses and hospitals, and they hide their missiles under UN positions and schools and things like that, if they're shooting at our civilians, we will have to destroy those positions. And of course, under the Geneva Conventions, we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to shoot where the fire is coming from. Of course, we'll get condemned by the BBC and the New York Times for it, but we have to defend our civilians. They will get destroyed. If we lose civilians, the response will be tenfold. Do you see that happening, or will it only happen once Iran acquires weapons of mass destruction, whether it's nuclear or biological missiles? So I mean, that's how I see it. Iran's trying to get weapons of mass destruction. Okay. And after they get their weapons of mass destruction, then Hezbollah will be able to attack us with these terrorist attacks without fear of reprisal, because we'll be too afraid of a nuclear or biological weapon. Do you have anything to say about that theory?
I have more than one thing to say about this theory. Let's begin with the first part of what you said, which is that Israel will go all out into war if we will be attacked, which is correct. And yet, for not a single moment, we don't forget the Geneva Convention and the international law. so that nobody would be mistaken. The fact that Hezbollah is hiding its ammunition inside the homes, it's a problem.
Right.
It's a challenge and it's a dilemma. And the IDF is investing a lot of efforts, and they're usually not being reported. But if you search a little bit, you find it because they were published what we had done in 2006 and in Gaza. But a lot of efforts to warn the population and to try to avoid collateral damage as much as possible. This is very important to emphasize because we are not ignoring the fact that civilians may get hurt. The second thing about the scenario that you just put on the table, I think that this is one of the scenarios, but actually I can't see a scenario that Israel will wait until Iran will have a mass destruction weapon. We will have to act earlier than that. We cannot afford this to happen. And I truly hope that we will not have to do that. Because we know, as people who are living in the north, that if we will initiate, and when I'm saying we, it means anybody in the West. It doesn't matter whether the Americans will attack eventually. We know that Hezbollah will launch rockets to Israel at the same time. This would be the retaliation immediately. Third, I think that there are more scenarios than that are not dealing with the issue of mass destruction weapon, which are scenarios of what we call gradual escalation. That we were very close to these scenarios to be fulfilled in the past 2 years. It happens few times that we didn't know whether in the next morning we're going to be recruited to war, me and you and all the others that are serving in the reserves. Because when Israel is operating against the Iranian involvement in Syria and the military deployment of Iran and Hezbollah in Syria, and Hezbollah combatants or commanders are getting killed, Hezbollah retaliate on the Lebanese border. Until today, luckily enough, no civilian was killed in those retaliations, only 2 soldiers, and Israel made a decision not to retaliate back if it's 2 soldiers. But what if it's 40 soldiers or children or just civilians? It may take us into a gradual escalation and then will take us to war. And this is a scenario which is, again, we were very close to it a few times in the past 2 years.
So, you know, Hezbollah and Iran and the Syrians, and we saw in Syria, they indiscriminately murder civilians. Something like over 1 million people were killed in the civil war in Syria, a lot by Iranian forces and Hezbollah forces, of course, and ISIS and all the different factions. That side murders civilians, okay? They target civilians. They know our weak point are our own civilians. We need to defend our civilians. When we retaliate to defend our civilians and target their weapons and terrorists who use human shields, we get condemned for it. What can the government do in Israel to keep pointing this out and to show the world that we're not initiating these attacks? What more do we have to do to tell our side of the story?
Well, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm being honest with you. On the one hand, it was important for me to establish a professional research center that will be loyal to the reality. But on the other hand, we are not trying to hide our identity. We are Israelis, and we want to tell our side of the story. We're not trying to convince, by the way. We just believe that people are intelligent enough. If they get all the picture, they can understand and make their own assumptions. The situation today is that this issue of the human shield is not getting enough exposure in the media, in the global media, and is getting, I think, the wrong approach in the international law. Did you know that if somebody throws a stone at you, you cannot kill him after he throws the stone because he's not armed anymore?
I think even while they're throwing the stone.
By the way, you cannot shoot him because he threw a stone. He didn't shoot you.
Right.
But
Meanwhile,
he was killed this week from a stone, right? From
2 days ago, we went in to arrest a terrorist in Jenin, and another terrorist dropped a cinder block on one of our soldiers, killing him, of course. And then the New York Times headline was "Stone kills Israeli soldier." The stone killed him, not the person who
threw the stone. It just fell from the sky.
Right.
So yes, this is why I'm doing. And one of the things we're doing in Alma is a simulation. We invite groups in to experience what we are experiencing, to become the Israeli cabinet for a few hours or an hour and a half. And that way to experience what we are experiencing, while the main message is that we don't have the right answers. It's not an escape room, that we just want people to experience the dilemma, to experience what we are having here, and the fact that how not updated is the international law, because the international, those who wrote it, imagined army versus an army, and here we have army versus terrorist group, or army versus an army that adopted terrorist method, like this is what is happening in Hezbollah. The Israeli government, it's not doing enough when we speak about this issue. What it is doing with the IDF is publishing the Hezbollah deployment in Beirut, in, Bekaa Valley, in other areas in Lebanon, and hoping that by these publications, people will understand that this ammunition is actually hidden in those areas. We are going to publish, by the way, a report about that, about Hezbollah military deployment in Beirut, that we have found from open sources. Unbelievable. And it's inside very crowded areas where the missiles are hidden.
So the last thing I really want to talk about with you is our enemies. And we have many enemies. Some of them are military enemies or terrorists or countries, but we have other enemies. We have enemies that are trying to demonize the state of Israel using the media, and they like to portray, or the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and they always try to paint the picture that Israel is a colonialist enterprise. And I think you, in your personal story of who you are and where your roots are, is very interesting. And just to counteract that narrative, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and where your parents' roots are from, and how they got to Israel?
Well, my family story, probably without knowing, shaped what I'm doing today. No doubt about that. I live in the Galilee in the past 13 years. It's me and my husband and our 5 children. He's mine and ours. I'm remarried. And my father was born in Damascus. He walked most of the way to Israel when he was 11 years old. And there were troubles to the Jewish community in Damascus back then in 1946, because the Syrians were fighting for their independence, like most of these countries in the area, not only Israel. And they were fighting against the French, but the Jews were affiliated with the French. And my father had 2 mother tongue languages, like French and Arabic. And that's why it became very dangerous to be in Damascus. And the first thing the Zionist movement did was to pull out the children or the youth. And every night, children walked across the border and came to Israel. About 1,000 children were brought this way to Israel. His mother, my grandmother, was born in Beirut. And the reason my father was raised in Damascus is because my grandfather was from Damascus, was a rich jeweler, by the way. That's why my family name is Zehavi. It's a Hebrew term to jeweler, to gold. because it was a rich family of jewelers. By the way, all the gold and property was left in Damascus. Nothing was brought to over here. And the small bag that my grandmother carried with her when she crossed the border, after a few months after my father, she gave all the jewelry to bribe the guards so she will be able to cross the border to Israel. She went through Lebanon, and she was Lebanese. And I still hope to visit Beirut one day and to go and to see these areas where my grandmother and Damascus, where my grandmother and my father grew up. Of my mother's side, it's even more interesting, since I'm a Palestinian refugee by international law. My grandmother was born in Hebron, and she was expelled from Hebron along with all other Jews in the West Bank in 1929. She was 7 years old, and she was rescued from the massacre in Hebron by a Muslim family that hid her and her parents and her brother, and they ran away to the old city of Jerusalem. And afterwards, they had to leave the old city of Jerusalem as well, right? So that's my family story.
I mean, that's so relevant when people, people forget that 50%, maybe even more than 50% of Israelis come from the Middle East.
Right.
That they predate the Arab conquest of the Middle East by thousands of years. There were Jews living here before the Arabs conquered the land, and the narrative out there is that the Ashkenazi Jews from Poland came after the Holocaust and kicked everyone out and made a European state here, and that's just not the case. But anyway, your story is just fascinating, and I think you should write a book about it.
Well, actually, one of our supporters in Alma, as I've said, it's a non-profit organization. He's a writer, he's an author, and his name is Cliff Sobin, and he wrote a book. Give me a moment. I know that I'm out of the screen, but I think it's nice to show the book.
Absolutely.
This is the book. Okay, can you see? Living
in Heaven, Coping with Hell.
Coping with Hell. And it's a book about the North, about interesting people that are living in the North of Israel.
Like me.
Founders. And he wrote a book about these people, and one of the chapters is about myself.
Oh, okay. And what was the author's name again?
Cliff Sobin.
Cliff Sobin. Okay, great. Well, Sarit Zehavi, thank you so much. I love your tours of the North with you and your other tour guides who are all officers in the IDF with immense experience having to do with Lebanon and Syria. It's really one of the highlights of our trip, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Shout out to John O'Rose behind the scenes, pulling the strings, also a travel specialist in his own right. There he is. And people, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You just click on that button down there on the bottom right-hand corner. And Sarit, we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
You're welcome. And we're out.